This is the second of two tapes on Two Treatises of Government by John Locke. John Locke's second treatise of government is called An Essay Concerning the True, Original Extent and End of Government. As indicated by this title, the second treatise considers three aspects of government: the philosophical foundation of governmental power, the extent or limits of that power, and the purpose for which government is created. Locke had to discuss these issues if he wanted to satisfy his primary objective in writing the second treatise, to justify the right of revolution against tyrannical governments. Understandably, Locke's defense of revolution is molded to fit the circumstances of late 17th century England. But as we shall see, Locke's basic principles apply universally to any age. This is what makes the second treatise one of the great works in political philosophy, and not merely a period piece. Locke's definition of political power is essential to his entire argument.
Political power I take to be a right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently all less penalties, for the regulating and preserving of property, and of employing the force of the community in the execution of such laws, and in the defence of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, and all this only for the public good.
Notice that Locke speaks of political power as a right of making laws backed by the penalty of death if need be. Locke uses this definition because he wants to explore legitimate political power, governments with moral foundations. Illegitimate rulers, conquerors, usurpers, and tyrants may rule in fact, but they do so by force, not by right. Throughout the second treatise, Locke maintains physical might can never legitimize political power. This passage from his discussion of conquest is typical.
That the aggressor, who puts himself into the state of war with another, and unjustly invades another man's right, can, by such an unjust war, never come to have a right over the conquered, will be easily agreed by all men, who will not think that robbers and pirates have a right of empire over whomsoever they have force enough to master, or that men are bound by promises which unlawful force extorts from them. Should a robber break into my house, and with a dagger at my throat make me seal deeds to convey my estate to him, would this give him any title? Just such a title by his sword has an unjust conqueror, who forces me into submission. The injury and the crime is equal, whether committed by the wearer of a crown or some petty villain.
Locke seeks to define political power, to differentiate between its just and unjust uses, and to show how it is derived and justified. He begins his analysis with a chapter called Of the State of Nature. The state of nature is a theoretical model of mankind without government. For Locke, as for other state-of-nature philosophers, a basic task of political philosophy is to show how the rights and powers of government derive from the rights and powers of individuals in a state of nature. As Locke says,
to understand political power right, and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is, a state of perfect freedom to order their actions, and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man.
Individuals in a state of nature enjoy perfect freedom to dispose of their possessions and persons within limits set by the law of nature. For Locke, the state of nature also involves equal liberty for all persons.
A state also of equality, wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, no one having more than another, there being nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature, and the use of the same faculties, should also be equal one amongst another, without subordination or subjection, unless the Lord and Master of them all should, by any manifest declaration of his will, set one above another, and confer on him, by an evident and clear appointment, an undoubted right to dominion and sovereignty.
This passage demonstrates the importance of Locke's earlier refutation of Sir Robert Filmer in the first treatise. God, according to Filmer, delegated an absolute right of political dominion to Adam, a right which descended to 17th-century monarchs. Locke demolishes this argument in the first treatise. Thus, with no reason to suppose God appointed some men to rule over others, Locke depicts the state of nature as a condition of equal freedom, a condition without political dominion or subordination. But Locke qualifies this argument. To say humans are equal to each other is not to say humans are equal to God, their Creator. Man owes obedience to God and his laws, even in a state of nature.
Though this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. Though man in that state have an uncontrollable liberty to dispose of his person or possessions, yet he has not liberty to destroy himself, or so much as any creature in his possession, but where some nobler use than its bare preservation calls for it.
Here, Locke is responding to the state of nature portrayed by Thomas Hobbes. In his Leviathan, published in 1651, Hobbes depicts the state of nature as a condition of incessant warfare among men. Hobbes goes on to say,
"To this war of every man against every man, this also is consequent, that nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have there no place. Where there is no common power, there is no law. Where no law, no injustice."
Locke disagrees. Although no human law governs man in a state of nature, there is a natural law of justice, a law of God discovered by reason. According to Locke, God created man, and so enjoys absolute dominion over him. We are God's property. Clearly, then, no person has a warrant to harm himself or another. To do so is to usurp the supreme authority of God.
The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, which obliges everyone. And reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. For men, being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, all the servants of one sovereign Master, sent into the world by his order and about his business, they are his property, whose workmanship they are, made to last during his, not one another's pleasure. And being furnished with like faculties, sharing all in one community of nature, there cannot be supposed any such subordination among us that may authorize us to destroy one another, as if we were made for one another's use, as the inferior ranks of creatures are for ours.
As God's workmanship, we have a duty to preserve our lives. This imposes moral limits in a state of nature. We are forbidden to interfere with the life-sustaining actions of others.
Everyone, as he is bound to preserve himself, and not to quit his station wilfully, so by the like reason, when his own preservation comes not in competition, ought he, as much as he can, to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of the life, liberty, health, limb, or goods of another.
For Locke, the just powers of government are derived from the just powers of individuals in a state of nature. If, therefore, a government's power to punish is to be justified, Locke must show how one man can legitimately punish another man in a state of nature.
Every offence that can be committed in the state of nature may, in the state of nature, be also punished equally, and as far forth as it may, in a commonwealth.
The right to punish in the state of nature stems from the right of every person to enforce or execute the law of nature.
That all men may be restrained from invading others' rights and from doing hurt to one another, and the law of nature be observed, which willeth the peace and preservation of all mankind. The execution of the law of nature is, in the state of nature, put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has a right to punish the transgressors of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. For the law of nature would, as all other laws that concern men in this world, be in vain, if there were nobody that in the state of nature had a power to execute that law, and thereby preserve the innocent and restrain offenders. And if anyone in the state of nature may punish another for any evil he has done, everyone may do so. For in that state of perfect equality, where naturally there is no superiority or jurisdiction of one over another, what any may do in prosecution of that law, everyone must needs have a right to do. And thus, in the state of nature, one man comes by a power over another.
Locke divides the right of punishment into two categories, reparation and restraint. Reparation is the right of the injured party to receive compensation from the offender. This is a private right, which is possessed only by the victim. Restraint is the right of every person to restrain the offender from committing additional violations. This is a public right, which may be enforced by anyone in a state of nature. Reparation and restraint. These, says Locke, are the only reasons why one man may lawfully do harm to another. When reparation and restraint are entrusted to a government, it acquires the right to punish.
From these two distinct rights, the one of punishing the crime for restraint and preventing the like offence, the other of taking reparation, which belongs only to the injured party, comes it to pass that the magistrate hath the common right of punishing put into his hands.
Punishment, according to Locke, should be proportioned to the crime. When enforcing the private right of reparation, when figuring, for example, how much an injured party should receive in damages, the proportionality requirement may not prove especially troublesome. But how do we calculate proportionality when enforcing the public right of restraint? What rational standard can tell us how much restraint is sufficient?
Each transgression may be punished to that degree, and with so much severity, as will suffice to make it an ill bargain to the offender, give him cause to repent, and terrify others from doing the like.
This answer lacks precision, and Locke knows it. Nonetheless, he believes natural law will yield a precise rule of proportionality to one who studies the problem closely.
It is certain there is such a law, and that too as intelligible and plain to a rational creature and a studier of that law as the positive laws of commonwealths, nay, possibly plainer.
Locke seeks to explain how a government's right to punish derives from the individual's right to punish in a state of nature. This is the foundation of political power. But political power includes more than the right to punish. It includes the right to punish with death in extreme cases. Does this right to inflict death exist in a state of nature? Yes, says Locke. We may kill a murderer, for example, because he renounces the rule of reason. He treats others like beasts of prey, so we may destroy him as we would any predatory animal.
Every man in the state of nature has a power to kill a murderer, both to deter others from doing the like injury, which no reparation can compensate, by the example of the punishment that attends it from everybody, and also to secure men from the attempts of a criminal, who, having renounced reason, the common rule and measure God hath given to mankind, hath, by the unjust violence and slaughter he hath committed upon one, declared war against all mankind, and therefore may be destroyed as a lion or tiger, one of those wild, savage beasts with whom men can have no society nor security.
Suppose Locke is correct. Suppose every person in the state of nature may execute the law of nature, acting as his own judge, jury, and enforcer. If this is true, why would any person ever surrender this right to a government? Sir Robert Filmer raised this question repeatedly. If we posit a state of nature consisting of free and independent individuals, then, Filmer argues, we will never arrive at a government. We will end in anarchy instead.
Since nature hath not distinguished the habitable world into kingdoms, nor determined what part of a people shall belong to one kingdom and what to another, it follows that the original freedom of mankind being supposed, every man is at liberty to be of what kingdom he please, and so every petty company hath a right to make a kingdom by itself, and not only every city, but every village, and every family, nay, and every particular man, a liberty to choose himself to be his own king if he please. And he were a madman that, being by nature free, would choose any man but himself to be his own governor. Thus, to avoid the having but of one king of the whole world, we shall run into a liberty of having as many kings as there be men in the world, which, upon the matter, is to have no king at all, but to leave all men to their natural liberty, which is the mischief the pleaders for natural liberty do pretend they would most avoid.
How does Locke meet Filmer's challenge? Why would free and equal men in a state of nature voluntarily subordinate themselves to government? Locke lists 3 deficiencies of a state of nature that cause men to form governments.
First, there wants an established, settled, known law, received and allowed by common consent to be the standard of right and wrong, and the common measure to decide all controversies between them. For though the law of nature be plain and intelligible to all rational creatures, yet men, being biased by their interest, as well as ignorant for want of study of it, are not apt to allow of it as a law binding to them in the application of it to their particular cases.
Secondly, the state of nature lacks a known and impartial judge to settle disputes. If a man acts as judge in his own case and enforces his own verdicts, he is likely to be swayed by passion, revenge, and carelessness.
Thirdly, in the state of nature, there often wants power to back and support the sentence when right, and to give it due execution. They who by any injustice offended will seldom fail, where they are able, by force, to make good their injustice. Such resistance many times makes the punishment dangerous, and frequently destructive to those who attempt it.
Because of these inconveniences which exist in a state of nature, Locke believes individuals prefer to delegate their right of punishing to governments. This is the origin of political power. After discussing the state of nature, Locke turns to what he calls the state of war. The state of war is essential to Locke's case for revolution, for, as we shall see, when a government places itself in a state of war against its subjects, revolution against that government becomes justified. What, according to Locke, is the state of war?
The state of war is a state of enmity and destruction, and therefore declaring by word or action not a passionate or hasty, but a sedate, settled design upon another man's life, puts him in a state of war with him against whom he has declared such an intention.
In Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes had described the state of nature as a state of war. But the state of nature, as Locke sees it, is essentially peaceful, and this distinguishes it from the state of war.
Here we have the plain difference between the state of nature and the state of war, which, however, some men have confounded, are as far distant as a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, and a state of enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction are one from another. Men living together according to reason, without a common superior on earth with authority to judge between them, is properly the state of nature. But force, or declared design of force upon the person of another, where there is no common superior on earth to appeal to for relief, is the state of war.
Locke does not regard the state of war and the state of nature as mutually exclusive. A state of war can occur in a state of nature, but it need not occur, as Hobbes had argued. Recall that Locke contrasts two kinds of society: a state of nature where there is no common judge or government to settle disputes, and a society where there is such a government. A state of war, Locke says, can occur in either condition.
Want of a common judge with authority puts all men in a state of nature. Force without right upon a man's person makes a state of war, both where there is and is not a common judge.
A state of war can occur with or without government. In either case, the individual has a right to use force in self-defense.
He who attempts to get another man into his absolute power does thereby put himself into a state of war with him, it being to be understood as a declaration of a design upon his life. For I have reason to conclude that he who would get me into his power without my consent would use me as he pleased when he had got me there, and destroy me too when he had a fancy to it. For nobody can desire to have me in his absolute power, unless it be to compel me by force to that which is against the right of my freedom, that is, make me a slave.
If your liberty is threatened by an aggressor, says Locke, then you may reasonably assume the aggressor is willing to deprive you of everything else, including your life. This is why killing a thief during a robbery is legitimate self-defense. This reasoning applies even when there is a government to adjudicate disputes, because during the robbery there is no time to appeal to this common judge. But what happens when the theft is over? What is the appropriate response then? It all depends, says Locke. Where there is a judge to which both parties can appeal, the state of war ceases immediately after the theft is over. But where there is no such common judge, the state of war continues, so the victim may continue to use force against the thief.
In the state of nature, for want of positive laws and judges with authority to appeal to, the state of war, once begun, continues, with the right to the innocent party to destroy the other whenever he can, until the aggressor offers peace.
Locke uses the thief example to illustrate the state of war and the right of self-defense. Here are the highlights of his argument so far. Point 1. A state of war begins whenever there is force without right, that is, whenever force is used unjustly. Point 2. This unjust use of force is not peculiar to the state of nature, but can exist under government as well. Point 3. The individual, when embroiled in a state of war, can legitimately use force in self-defense. Point 4. A state of war continues so long as there is no impartial judge to which all parties can appeal. Point 5 is Locke's conclusion. An unjust government can throw society into a state of war.
Where an appeal to the law and constituted judges lies open, but the remedy is denied by a manifest perverting of justice and a barefaced wresting of the laws to protect or indemnify the violence or injuries of some men or party of men, there it is hard to imagine anything but a state of war.
Government, Locke maintains, should administer just and impartial laws. When government defaults on this duty, then like a thief or murderer, it becomes an aggressor, a threat to society at large. Moreover, when a person is harmed by an unjust government, there is no earthly judge to which he can appeal his case. Thus a victim can use force in self-defense. And he can continue to use force. That is, he can participate in revolution until justice is restored. Later in the second treatise, Locke defends this position in detail, for now he previews his argument.
Wherever violence is used and injury done, though by hands appointed to administer justice, it is still violence and injury, however coloured with the name, pretences, or forms of law, the end whereof being to protect and redress the innocent by an unbiased application of it to all who are under it. Wherever that is not bona fide done, war is made upon the sufferers, who, having no appeal on earth to right them, they are left to the only remedy in such cases, an appeal to heaven.
Sir Robert Filmer was a perceptive critic of social contract theories, and on several occasions in the second treatise, Locke tries to answer Filmer's objections. For instance, according to Filmer, the great hue and cry raised against governments which violate liberty is so much nonsense. All governments and all laws necessarily restrict liberty. As Filmer put it,
A great deal of talk there is in the world of the freedom and liberty that they say is to be found in popular commonwealths. It is worth the inquiry how far and in what sense this speech of liberty is true. True liberty is for every man to do what he list, or to live as he please, and not to be tied to any laws. But such liberty is not to be found in any commonweal, for there are more laws in popular estates than anywhere else, and so consequently less liberty. And government, many say, was invented to take away liberty, not to give it to every man. Such liberty cannot be. If it should, there would be no government at all.
true liberty, Filmer says, is the liberty to do as one pleases without the constraint of laws, and no government can permit this kind of liberty to exist. In responding to this argument, Locke distinguishes two kinds of liberty. The first is liberty in a state of nature.
The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule.
The second is liberty under government.
The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the Commonwealth, nor under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what the legislative shall enact, according to the trust put in it.
Natural liberty in a state of nature and social liberty under government. Both kinds of liberty, Locke says, are restrained by rules.
Freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to every one of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where the rule prescribes not, and not to be subject to the unconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature.
Liberty, for Locke, means freedom of the individual from the absolute and arbitrary power of other persons, including government. To define liberty as Filmer does, to say liberty includes an unqualified freedom to enslave and murder others, strikes Locke as absurd. Locke thinks the principle of liberty applies equally to all persons. Hence, a coherent definition of liberty must include restraints on actions which violate this equal liberty. In a state of nature, these restraints are imposed by the laws of nature. In a society under government, these restraints are imposed by a legislative power established by the consent of the people. This legislative power passes laws, or as Locke calls them, standing rules to live by. Just laws, therefore, do not diminish liberty, they enhance and preserve it. Locke now turns to a question addressed by many 17th and 18th century philosophers. Can a person consent to become a slave? That is, can a man agree to surrender his natural rights totally and irrevocably, thereby putting himself under the absolute and arbitrary power of another man? The recurring debate over voluntary slavery had nothing to do with the real world of chattel slavery as practiced by European countries. Rather, this debate addressed the theoretical possibility of political slavery within the social contract model. If the individual can voluntarily alienate all his rights and so become a slave, then it is also possible for an entire people to surrender all their rights to a government and so fall under its absolute control. And if this occurs, no right of resistance or revolution is left. The immensely influential Dutch philosopher Hugo Grotius defended this view. In his book On the Law of War and Peace, published in 1625, Grotius had this to say:
"It is lawful for any man to engage himself as a slave to whom he pleases. Why then should it not therefore be as lawful for a people that are at their own disposal to deliver up themselves to any one or more persons, and transfer the right of governing them upon him or them, without recovering any share of that right to themselves?"
In theory, according to Grotius, people can contract themselves into political slavery, but it is unreasonable to assume this has ever happened. Why, after all, would people voluntarily leave a state of nature for a society with government if that government offered nothing but abject servitude? John Locke takes a different view. For him, voluntary slavery is not even theoretically possible. To surrender one's liberty is, in effect, to surrender the means to preserve one's life, and only God has this absolute power over human life. As Locke says,
This freedom from absolute arbitrary power is so necessary to and closely joined with a man's preservation that he cannot part with it, but by what forfeits his preservation and life together. For a man, not having the power of his own life, cannot, by compact or his own consent, enslave himself to anyone, nor put himself under the absolute arbitrary power of another to take away his life when he pleases. Nobody can give more power than he has himself, and he that cannot take away his own life cannot give another power over it.
Many times in the second treatise, Locke stresses that the primary purpose of government is to protect property.
The great and chief end of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property.
Today, the word property suggests something that is owned, such as a house or a car. But during the 17th and 18th centuries, the word property conveyed a broader meaning. Then, it frequently referred not to an object, but to a right to use and dispose of something. Thus, instead of saying, "This house is my property," a 17th century writer might say, "I have a property in this house." The philosopher William Wollaston, writing in the early 1700s, summarized this widely held approach to property.
To have the property of anything, and to have the sole right of using and disposing of it, are the same thing. They are equivalent expressions.
This broad conception of property led many 17th and 18th century philosophers to speak of property in one's life, property in one's liberty, property in one's estate, and so forth. James Madison, the father of America's Constitution, referred to property in one's opinions and the free communication of them, property in one's religious opinions, property in the safety and liberty of one's person, property in the free use of one's faculties, and property in one's time. John Locke normally uses the word property to denote a right to one's life, liberty, and estate. This passage is typical.
Man, being born, as has been proved, with a title to perfect freedom, and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, equally with any other man or number of men in the world, hath by nature a power to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of other men.
The word estate, as used in this passage, signifies material possessions, including land. Thus, when Locke says government should protect property, he means government should protect the rights to life, liberty, and material goods. This brings us to Locke's justification of private property, where we find some of the most influential arguments in the history of political theory. Here, we need to recall Locke's debate with Robert Filmer. Did God, as Filmer argued, give Adam private dominion over the earth and its creatures? No, says Locke. God gave all men dominion over the earth. This raises a serious problem. If natural resources originally belonged to all men in common, then how can we justify private property? Suppose a person fences off some land for his private use while excluding others. Is this justified? In other words, how can we begin with common dominion and end up with private dominion? Locke intends to solve this problem.
I shall endeavour to show how men might come to have a property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact of all the commoners.
Locke was not the first philosopher to grapple with the problem of private property. Far from it. The notion that property was originally owned in common had been defended by Christian thinkers for many centuries. Therefore, philosophers had to explain how private ownership arose from communal ownership, and why this transition was morally justified. This was the task undertaken by John Locke. This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.